So the TCRC is back this week.
Hello, good afternoon.
Yes. Hello.
I think we're just about ready to begin. So my name is Noel Reyes. I'm Associate Director for Community Partnerships at Tisch College. And I'm really excited to be with you today for today's Civic Life Lunch, which is called Thinking About Community Knowledge and Research Partnerships with TCRC. So I'm excited to be here in conversation about this topic. One, because the question of community knowledge and honoring community knowledge and establishing research partnerships is so central to the work of Tisch College. And that's something that we really want to highlight and foreground here. And another reason I'm excited to be here is because I get to speak with a cherished colleague and friend, Elaine Donnolley. So I just want to begin by introducing Elaine. Elaine is the director of Tisch College Community Research Center, TCRC. She is also a research professor at Tisch College. She holds a PhD in public policy and has published articles on a number of topics, including establishing research partnerships between community organizations and universities and what it takes to make those partnerships resilient. And she's done a lot of other interesting things too, including being a connector and a partnership builder between universities and community organizations. She served in the Peace Corps. But by way of introduction, I also wanted to mention, I had the pleasure of going to a conference with Elaine about 2 years ago in Minneapolis. And one of the things that we had a chance to do there was go to the place where George Floyd was murdered. This was about 3 years after it happened, and learn about the kind of organizing and efforts that emerged from that place and the ways in which people were telling the story and organizing, and it raised so many questions for us about our work. And I think from that point on, Elaine has been such a valuable thought partner for me in thinking about what is the place of Tisch College and how are we approaching this work. And so for all of those reasons, I'm so excited to be in conversation with Elaine Donnolley. So let's please welcome our featured speaker. So Elaine, I'd like to begin by saying this. So there's a lot going on in the world, in the country, and I guess I just wanted to ask, with everything that's going on, how are you doing?
First, thank you, Noel. The opportunity to have this conversation with Noel, I really deeply appreciate you. Second of all, that's such a loaded question. I would say that I'm very grateful that every day I know about, hear about, talk with people who are doing something actionable, you know, and that is inspiring. So yeah, I feel I'm holding on to the inspiration piece. Thanks.
I'm excited, of course, to talk about the work of TCRC. But before getting there, I wanted to ask a kind of bigger question, which is, what is community engaged research? Like, how do you define that? And then for the audience too, I thought, there are so many sort of acronyms that are associated with this, like PAR, Participatory Action Research. I guess maybe you can talk about what that is and how you view that.
So I guess first I would start with what is community, right? And we kind of take this broad lens to community, and it's people who share something. And most often we're talking about geographic communities, you know, people who live in the same place, but oftentimes it's a shared experience, a shared identity, some commonality between people. And so then when we talk about what is community engaged research or what is community knowledge, you know, because this is at the center of it. And, you know, we think about where does our knowledge come from, right? We have our formal education, you know, here at Tufts or elsewhere, and an informal education. We also have we carry lots of knowledge, each of us, from our families, from our neighborhoods, from our own lived experiences. And we bring all of this with us, whether or not it's explicit, in a degree or a course, or whether it's more tacit knowledge about kind of how we look at the world. And so when we talk about community engaged research at TCRC, I think we're really talking about centering community knowledge in the research process. So TCRC is largely predicated on kind of some core values, right? It's around centering this community knowledge. It's around equitable partnerships. So instead of a researcher from a university dropping into community, collecting data and leaving, it's really about questions that come out of community. And the third thing I would say is around actionable findings. So it's knowledge creation, less for, put it on the shelf, but more about how can this be impactful for all the partners involved.
There's a way in which the kind of research that you are describing kind of goes against the grain, right? Why the kind of research that you're describing, why is it often not the kind of research that typically takes place in universities?
Yeah, I guess I would think about even my own education and a PhD program and how in the US, conventionally, people are trained to do research. And I'm gonna put this on the board. We think about it in terms of like a continuum, right? If you have over here kind of more conventional, and I will say US-based models, because there's lots of research that goes around the world, indigenous methodologies and so on that have different approaches. And then we focus on more participatory approaches. So research kind of can fall along this entire continuum. I'm talking specifically about community engaged research. And it can move along the continuum during a single study, but over here, the traditional model, we have a researcher, who has an idea, has a question, has an interest, knows the literature, sees a gap in the literature, sees a funding opportunity, what have you, and comes up with a question, maybe partners with community members, but more as human subjects, that the community is being studied in a sense. Collects data, the analysis happens outside of community, the interpretation of the findings and how the findings are ultimately shared. They might be shared in peer review journals that community members can't even access. They can be shared in academic language. They're not necessarily accessible or the priority of the community. And as you move further and further along the continuum, you have more kind of questions that come out of community. What are the key priorities? You have, because we're talking about, this can happen out without university partners, but because we're talking about community university partnerships, these are teams that have community partners and university partners that are co-researchers on the team. So they develop the design together. They collect data together. The data tends to be more relevant and representative. The analysis happens collaboratively. People bring different skill sets to the table. Like not everyone might have some statistical modeling experience, but you bring that to the table with other kinds of knowledge and about analyses processes. And then the findings, right? The way the findings are then shared. They're shared in ways that are more useful for community. Like maybe the findings are put together for legislative testimony, like TCRC projects have done, or maybe they are changing the way an organization, a hospital does its well-being assessments, to really understand what's happening in community, and because community residents are actually doing the assessments and part of that team. So there's kind of longer term changes. Maybe it provides a proof of concept for something, a community question that they can then seek funding for example. That's the gist.
I love that you drew us a diagram to answer that question. That's awesome. Thank you. And it also gives me a kind of a sense of like visual appreciation of the landscape, right? How lots of research has traditionally been done. And this is a good kind of lead into my question about TCRC, right? So obviously, Tisch College Community Research Center sort of places itself on this side of the spectrum, right? On trying to engage communities. So I guess it's a good time to ask, can you just talk about how TCRC came about, right? And the kind of work that you are centering with community now.
So I would say, I think it's up here. I mean, this is essentially our mission statement, you know, around democratizing research processes. And it came about, I would say, a big piece. I wasn't here when it first came about, although there's some people in the room that were, largely because there is not, or has traditionally not been a lot of support or recognition for changing kind of the hierarchies of knowledge, you know, and kind of in this process of centering community knowledge in research. Definitely not funding for proof of concept for participatory pilots. TCRC was created at its heart is a steering committee that's half community partners. These tend to be individuals from local organizations, although sometimes they're from city government or sometimes they're local community activists, community leader, and Tufts faculty and staff who are really committed to this work. And they provide guidance for this work, you know, kind of across the past 18 years or so that it's been operative. And I would say, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that its kind of kickoff project was the communities assessing freeway exposure and health, which is still ongoing. And I just had a conversation with that, with Doug Brugge, who started that recently, to talk about how it's still ongoing and how it's kind of came out of community questions out of Somerville in Chinatown, how small particle pollution was impacting their health.
One thing that would sort of help me wrap my head around the work of TCRC would be, and like, it seems to me like kind of difficult to enact all of these ideas or all of these values, right? So centering community knowledge and theory, I understand what you mean, right? But in the actual work of doing the research, probably much harder, right? So I guess maybe you could share with us like an example of a project from TCRC that sort of highlights the ways in which you are engaging in these practices, right, that are centering community knowledge. So maybe it could be that one or one that comes to mind, but I think, you know, it would help us understand.
I would like to talk about a project with the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center because students were at the core of this, and BCNC is based out of Boston. It's been around for like 50 or 60 years, but they also serve increasingly residents in the city of Quincy. So BCNC supports immigrants to the U.S., particularly Asian immigrants, to thrive, you know, so kind of a broad spectrum of work. And in Quincy, this is a city of like 100,000 people. It has the fastest growing Asian population in Massachusetts. You know, between 2010 to 2020 census, that population grew by 50%. And so there are a lot of social services in Quincy, but not necessarily tied to people who are living there now, you know? And so what BCNC really wanted to understand better was, you know, what services exist, speaking about social services, and how culturally and linguistically responsive are they to folks who live there. So we had a team, we had an AmeriCorps Vista, always Hassan, and we had 5 students from Tufts. 4 undergraduates and 1 graduate student. You know, 2 of these young people grew up in Quincy in immigrant families. Their parents still live there. They're here at Tufts. They really understood some of the nuanced, say, political history or kind of how neighborhoods relate to each other. They understood some of the the more invisible things about Quincy. And a third student grew up in Boston, grew up in BCNC, essentially. She talked about how BCNC raised her, and she was a youth leader in the organization, and she understood the organization as a constituent. And then we had another student that really understood GIS mapping. We had faculty advising on this, and another student that could bring together some of the census data and some of the statistical analyses. And what these students did is they took all kinds of secondary data. They worked with Yo-Yo Yao and other members at BCNC, other staff members, and they interviewed organizations in Quincy. They knew what organizations existed, first of all, and they went around and spoke with all these organizations to find out what kinds of programs not only exist, but who serves them, what capacity the folks have to serve the residents who are living in these neighborhoods. And they mapped out, where transportation is, where people live, who lives where, what languages they speak, how long have they been in the country, do they have health insurance, all these kinds of data, and mapped it together. And this is stuff that BCNC and their organizational partners in Quincy are still using to this day. In fact, they just, the ED of BCNC just reached out recently and asked about census data and how they're using it based on this project. So it's kind of now they're looking to get deeper training on using the census data themselves so they can kind of dig deeper into this work. So it's an ongoing thing.
Yeah, and it sounds like students were able to utilize their knowledge, their connections, because you had some students who were from Quincy. It kind of gives the sense of a great example of how you kind of centering their knowledge and experience in the research itself. So yeah, thank you for that example.
I think it's a good example of how we are all part of communities, so there's a really artificial divide, I think, between universities and community, and we are all members of multiple communities, and these students are using their understanding of that.
So I would imagine that some students would be interested, or maybe are here or watching because they're interested in doing this kind of work or this kind of research in particular. And so, what is some advice or maybe some things that you would want students to know, right? Particularly at Tufts who are interested in doing this kind of research.
First, I would like you to know about this guide. And major kudos to August Smith, who's here, and their predecessor, Deepika Bahari, who worked on this guide. This is specifically for Tufts students. It's very direct. And it just is a very kind of quick read overview about participatory research and about engaging with partners in research. I guess the takeaways I would say is, one, start with relationships. I think this guide came out of lots of questions over time, but particularly, and Shirley knows this question, students who had come and said, we really want to work with these community partners. We really want to interview, 3 Haitian women who are unemployed, who are new to this country by Tuesday. It was like, well, think about it. If you step back and think about yourself and who do you work with, and who it's all based out of relationships. If you have relationships with people, I think there's lots of tools that exist to do some kind of internal reflective assessment about who am I? What do I bring to the table? How can I get to know people? Some of it is very practical, networking, showing up, being helpful and not less demanding about interviewing residents and more about, we need to do a community cleanup. I'm going to be part of that.
Before we move to some questions from the audience, I just have 2 more questions, and then maybe other folks will have questions too. I wanted to ask you also, because I think, I know that TCRC has a very unique structure in the way you make decisions. And I think something about the way TCRC is structured also kind of like reflects the values that you're talking about. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about like, how is it structured and how do you make decisions? Kind of like the way TCRC is I guess operates.
Yeah, I mentioned the steering committee. I would say on a regular basis, a weekly basis, so everything, most of the work that I do involves the chairs. So we have a community partner chair and a faculty chair, co-chair. So a lot of the stuff that happens kind of at meetings and so on is really pulled together with the co-chairs. And sometimes that is shorthand, but things that need to get done. And one of TCRC's challenges is that it's based in the university, that so that there is, as one of the co-chairs likes to say, a real gravitational pull that the university has. And so the steering committee, I think, provides a lot of counter pull, back towards community and making it kind of local, making it a focus on and accountable to our Tufts neighbors. There are bylaws, there's a whole process set up, but largely how the steering committee works has been about conversations, individual conversations and building relationships and hearing feedback and sometimes not happy feedback. But I think that what we do, we move together. The TCRC is maybe not, maybe in some cases moves a little more slowly, but I think that's okay.
And lastly, I wanted to ask about your sort of vision for the future. So there have been a number of studies, like the BCNC one, the CAFE study, right? Some of which are still ongoing, which communities have been able to use and utilize the findings from in many ways. I guess, how are you viewing the direction of TCRC, its place at Tisch and Tufts, and some things that you're hoping to do in the future?
I think TCRC has a very strong track record over so many times as far as the quality of the research and the equitable partnerships within the research that it supports. I think it's grown a lot. Maybe that in part is because the work that I'm most familiar with is the last 5 years. And I feel like it's grown a lot. I think we're trying to move things across on multiple fronts. One is, building community capacity to use research, to produce research, to co-create with Tufts stakeholders. We're also building Tufts capacity to do the same, with community stakeholders. And some of those are individual and some of those are systems. And so my vision for TCRC is that we are, a hub, where, we don't have to fund all the research. We don't have to be involved in all the research, but we could be a go-to resource, whether or not community partners, for example, are working with Tufts, or whether or not, but that we change the way things are done at Tufts, the way that people view community engaged research and understand how much it increases the rigor. It's not a nice to have, it's a need to have. And that community partners have access to these resources so that they can do things on their own. I don't know if you've been involved in any communities where you do research, right? Yeah, I've been on teams, we've done surveys and focus groups and so on without any partners. I mean, I think communities have this capacity, but supporting kind of the expansion of that capacity is critical. Does that answer your question? I could go on about, can I have big dreams for TCRC? That's a whole nother conversation.
I mean, certainly it does, and I think we share a belief that universities should sort of re-center themselves, right, or re-center their priorities in the way that, as I think about history or the way most research has been done, right, or the way most knowledge is located in professors. And it's not to say that they don't necessarily have knowledge, but what does it look like to recognize and honor the knowledge of communities, right, in a university structure, right? Certainly complicated. So I appreciate you sort of, talking about how, TCRC can be a center of that here.
I think we can provide opportunities to really pull different kinds of knowledge, different sets of skills together. Not everybody comes to the table or needs to come to the table with the same set of experience, skills, and so on. But it's about kind of pulling that together for kind of mutual benefit, mutual growth.
So I think this is a good time to open it up to the audience for questions. So if anyone has a question, please ask. I'm calling on, it's a person. I guess I'm the person who calls on people. So I'm Tanya. Tanya, please.
So I have a comment and a question. Just my comment is that slightly before coming here, I've been here less than a year, and the position I had before coming here, we had just recently gotten a grant from the Department of Justice, and they did a big, press conference to announce who all got these grants. And the director of the National Institute for Justice, which is the research arm of the Department of Justice, was at this press conference. And when she got up to talk, I totally had a big chip on my shoulder. I was thinking this is going to be your standard high level academic, double blind, she's going to be all about that kind of institutional kind of research. And she got up and she did start talking about it and her training in it and her expertise in it. And she said, and I'm realizing now that I was trained the totally wrong way. I was trained in not the right way to do research. And she was really gravitating more and talked about this more in community engaged research and the skills of both, how they come together then. And so I just thought about that in terms of how you're saying this. Sometimes people say this makes it less rigorous, but it actually makes it more rigorous. And I think too, it was very exciting for me to see that even at that level of, institutional practice, that she was recognizing that for this really to be strong research, we need to incorporate more of the community. So that was just my comment. My question was about the last question you answered about being located on the university. And I realize this isn't it's not as easy as it might sound, but I was wondering if you had those dreams you have for TCRC. Could you imagine that kind of gravitational pull would also shift a little bit if you were able to have some office space, whether you were there all the time or sometimes or whatever, in a community organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think, all right, so my own bias is you make things work where you are, with what you have. That's kind of, but I have worked in a community research center that was based in community, that was, on, so it does just change it a little bit. But it was also offered programs and stuff. I think that, I think what TCRC does is pretty rare, even though there are a billion community-engaged research centers out there. You know what I mean? And I think that what we do, we were very lean and we're kind of really focused in a way that I think if we were kind of a community-based center, physically in a community, would it be Somerville? And what would that mean for our Boston partners too? I think because we are kind of have this broader footprint, there is a value of where we are. And we have less emphasis on some of the direct programming. And there's a need to be more kind of get up out of your seat and go somewhere else. And so I think there can also be value in that and showing up where people are instead of people coming to you. So I don't know if that answers your question, just thinking that through out loud.
Thank you.
So you talked about the cafe project, which is ongoing, I think you said. Are there some other examples of projects that are ongoing or in the past that you could highlight for us as examples?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are so many.
Maybe some of your faves.
Some of my faves. All right, well, some of my faves right now is August Smith. I'm going to point them out again. We're working with Sociedad Latina. This is we were just there on Thursday. So this is a question that their community wellness, not community wellness, youth wellness committee. So these are all young people ages like 14 to 19. And Sociedad Latina is a youth development leadership organization based out of Mission Hill. And their ED is on my steering committee. And they had this question. They really wanted to understand how, not just how social media impacts young people, because there's a lot of research on that. They wanted to know, how does social media impact me, impact people in my neighborhood, impact Latino youth, impact kids in Boston? They wanted stuff that was really more targeted. And the organization was like, yeah, because, we're talking to Ed Markey's office about state, possible regulations. We're talking to AG Campbell's office about possible, who's suing Meta. Like, we're talking to all these people, like, this would be really good to know, understand. And so this team, so August Smith is our AmeriCorps Vista, who has been really leading the survey and the kind of the analysis of this project. The survey was developed with this team of young people who basically went through kind of some sample questions and really reshaped this survey. And the survey was implemented over a couple of times in like May and July. And the analysis was happening this fall. August just shared some of the key findings with the team. The analysis happened with staff instead, through multiple kind of meetings with staff, kind of what are the core questions that we want to pull out, what are the patterns we want to pull out. And then the next steps are, okay, these are the initial understanding about how people use their phones, the types of social media they use, and how that maps against a field tested metric for well-being, that has already an existing instrument, and kind of where do we want to take this from here? That's a gist. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, August. Or that I love that, because my hope is that kind of in the next kind of phase of this, that some of the young people could kind of take a bigger leadership role in this project and kind of shape, because the next phase is focus groups can really shape that and actually facilitate that themselves.
I really love that project, because as a former high school history teacher, one, to see the impact of the use of technology, but also there are so many policies that adults enact on children. And there's an obvious question to ask, which is, what should we do about this, right? To center somebody's experience. So I think this is a particular case where you're centering community knowledge, but you're centering another group of people whose knowledge is often not centered, which is young people. So I think on many levels, I just appreciate the work that you're doing with the study. I think, Jen had a question.
I did. Now I have two, but I'm gonna just ask one. Thank you both. This is really great. And I just love seeing two of our colleagues interviewing each other. It's a great event. Thank you to everybody who made it happen. My question is actually about, is there a community of practice in academia outside of Tufts? Like, are there other Elaines, or not as great, obviously, other places? And so what is that like? Because to me, I think one of the points that your comments made me think about is, how are we training the next generation of community engaged researchers who are in like PhD programs or postdocs? Is that, am I thinking too far ahead? Is that, or is there an informal or formal community of practice in other universities like this?
That's a great question. I guess I would go back a little bit and say that these approaches, this isn't like a method, right? These approaches are not like brand spanking new, right? Like you think about the 1940s, think about the 1970s, they come from different disciplines, right? So you have, CVPR, which really comes out of like public health and Kurt Lewin and kind of the 1940s. And then you have, PAR, which comes a lot of sociology and community development, and Paulo Freire, and you have like a lot of different traditions that kind of feed into this. And what TCRC does is take kind of a broad umbrella approach, like not prescriptive about this particular discipline or this particular thing, but focusing on some of the core values around equitable partnerships, centered community knowledge, and actionable findings. And so I think there is a broad spectrum of people. Like we have a sister organization in Detroit that I look to and have like met with to talk about this work. We also have, because Tufts is part of Campus Compact, there's a group called Truckin, called, I forget what that stands for. It's research universities who are engaged, civically engaged research universities. Anyway, there's a small group in that I've been meeting with, as well as Sana, I don't know, she's here, that is just focused on ethics and community-based research. And so what we have done is put together some teaching cases about participatory research and kind of troubleshooting things at the university, actually, because there's a lot of, systems that are not built for this type of research that are, if it's, that's built towards more clinical research or what have you, so that people can workshop and troubleshoot. And then it's just, I think that people who do this work, whether community-based or university-based, have a certain collaborative quality. And so I think I find a very informal network. I have some mentors, for example, that have been doing this work for decades and decades and decades, who are so generous. So I think yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And as far as PhD programs, like I totally agree, because I think there's such a small portion of PhD programs really train people in this. I would say even in my PhD program, I have to seek it out. Even though it existed, it wasn't, I taught research methods in a doctoral program, and the syllabus that they gave me to start off did not have anything participatory in it. Like I had to embed it. Like it's not standard. And in part, I think some of the argument is because you need to be able to finish a dissertation in a short amount of time, and participatory research takes a long time unless you have to nurture relationships and so on. So I think it's rare, that not impossible, but it's not common for dissertations to take a participatory approach.
Please.
I have a question directly related to that. So to sort of put a fine point on that, I have been railing against the incentive structures within the university. That the reason why we don't have this more firmly embedded in programs is because we have this like wacky, perverse incentive structure that values, like I've been on search committees where people are so fixated on H index, right? That says these are the quality of publications that you published in and how often or whatever, and it's totally raked against this kind of work. So in a perfect world, what would be a metric that you would like to see incorporated into tenure and promotions, for example? Like if we say we're the university that values this and we want to be the leader, what could we do that would turn that on its ear?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a couple of things come to mind, and I think talking about different kinds of impact, right? Like, I think the reason why these indices are used is because it's hard to measure the impact of a article, but you can use different measures to understand the impact of legislative testimony, for example, or these other outcomes. And it would be, I think, expanding, say, in the TMP process, what your portfolio consists of. Peer-reviewed articles, yes, but also, these other, like has a, the city of Medford, city government of Medford changed the way they do town halls because it had a community conversation structure through a research grant that kind of would train people in how to surface resident concerns. You know what I mean? And how can you include that into a TMP portfolio? Right now, it's hard.
Hi, I understand like you were mentioning about the value of like participatory research and being very community based. But I was just wondering like how you deal with like working with different demographics, like whether it's like race, social class, like vulnerable groups, and like what role do community partners like help you when you're dealing with those kind of barriers?
Yeah, I would, that's a great question. Thank you. For me, it's, so I would say I'm not doing all the research TCRC, first of all, like these are not all my relationships. So one of our core program is a seed funding program. So we provide kind of support for other people doing their participatory research. And so these are kind of teams of the community partner and a faculty partner who are doing something. And so I am not embedded in those relationships. I am a support. So I'll meet with them, but it's really just about if they're trying to navigate something, they want to talk about ideas. Maybe I can make an introduction. So I would take that's separate. I think I am very conscious of who I am, right? I'm a middle-aged white woman, cisgender, and that I carry with me that's just who I am. But I also bring this lived experience and this formal experience as well. And I think because everything starts with relationships, I think that's more of a person-to-person, individual, and I don't have a prescriptive like do A then B then C because it's so tailored. And I think there are times where I'm not the best voice for something, and there are times where I'm a good voice for something. And it's trying to recognize those things, I think meeting new people, I rely a lot on warm handshakes, on building kind of a network with other people. So like Shirley, for example, when I started at Tufts at Tisch, provided a lot of warm handshakes, like, introduced me, sat with me, this is so-and-so, let's have a conversation. Little things like that, I think make a huge difference because people lend their credibility to you, in a sense, That,
Yeah.
do you want to do a follow-up or?
No, that's perfect.
Okay.
I have a perhaps more niche question for the token scientists among us, but such a great conversation and important one given our Tufts DNA that Tisch really embodies regarding civic life and community engagement. You mentioned systems level or institutional level hurdles or challenges. I'm curious what implications this kind of work has for things like getting IRB approval and going through ethics review and like what anecdotes you might have for navigating those systems level processes.
Yeah. So there's a group actually on campus that a few of us have started that's really faculty research, like university-based researcher focused, because it's talking about Tufts as an institution. And there've been subcommittee people working on IRB, on financial processes, like how do you pay someone who's undocumented, that type of thing. And I think it's a slow going process, but I think maybe I have some bias here, but I feel like there's a groundswell, And so, for example, the IRB, a few years ago, a team of people had met up. Let me go back anymore. We had a springboard grant to look at participatory practices as of the research process itself, to think about it in terms of anti-racist practice, But what came out of that was really like, how do we navigate this, like the IRB in institution? And so this team of about 15 people, again, half faculty, half community partners, were talking about these practices and talking about some of the things that came up with IRB. And so I ended up then interviewing people across the university and community partners who had through seed grants and stuff, how to jump through hoops or change their research because they were like, I'm not going to be able to get this through. And then I went through the literature. There's a lot of literature on this, right? Because people are struggling with this. Struggling with an IRBs at different institutions that are focused on individual harms, which is important, but not about community harms. The unit of analysis is different and such a clinical approach, right? I think we met with IRB, right? So I met with a couple people from IRB multiple times. Now, one of my colleagues says that that was influential, all our work was influential, and then shifting some of the practices a couple years ago. I don't know if that's true, it's kind of a dotted line, but I think there's a receptiveness to this, and I think people, I don't know all like the state and federal policy that impacts IRB, so I would rely on the guidance, but I think there's room for interpretation and there's room for understanding that maybe, for example, we need to have a Tisch satellite IRB person who can, with things that are very low risk, can kind of do some kind of faster approval processes for community engagement research, for example. Or somebody within the IRB that's just focused on participatory research. You don't have to like retell the story every time you have a new analyst. You know what I mean? That they know this stuff backwards and forwards, like they do state law, you know what I mean? They know this stuff backwards and forwards too. I think there's a lot of things happening in the financial processes. I think people are really thinking about, how do I pay someone if they don't have access to a bank? You know what I mean? Like, how do I pay someone if they don't have I can't use gift cards because we have this rule. I think a lot of these things are stumbling blocks that we are, as long as we can collect them, then we can approach them as we uncover them. I think, join the team.
Yeah. Give it, sir. Absolutely.
Yes.
What principles of R might be applicable to any researcher, even if they don't want to do R? But just how might R sort of cross-fertilize other kinds of academic research?
So I think I still think the core, when you talk about other academic research, you're still talking about community engaged research in some way, but just not PAR. What do you mean by other?
No, I'll just throw out a few that I heard you talk about. So you talked about respect for knowledge, different kinds of knowledge. That could be true in the context of medical research that has nothing to do with a community screening process, but comes up because there are different ways of thinking about labor and delivery. I'm making this up as I go. Yeah. Or anyway, so that there are sort of, there's a discipline here and a set of principles that might be useful, even if you're not going to work directly with a community, but you want to expand your approach to research or to engaging with knowledge in the world. That's normal.
Yeah. I would say the kind of the multiple sources of knowledge would be core, like to that, that I'm gonna use this as an example. This is because a colleague told me this story about, this is set in Lowell, this is a colleague I had in Lowell, about a project that was funded through a foundation to address kind of some of the asthma concerns, in Lowell. And they found, they did all this background work that putting certain kinds of covers on mattresses really helps, and so they distributed these covers. It was funded, they distributed these covers, and then essentially they came back, and with a particular community from Myanmar who had a box of covers for the mattresses, and they were very appreciative, like thank you, very polite, but they didn't use them. And they were like, well, why did you use them? And it was, well, because we don't use mattresses. You know, we have these special mats, and these mattress covers are useless with these mats, you know? And so I just think like, I still think at the core, somebody in this really well-intentioned and good kind of project that wasn't, was really around kind of asthma reduction and reducing the rates of asthma in children, needs other sources of information, you know, other sources of knowledge. I think even if it's not a participatory or CBPR project or PAR project, you can still access those other sources of knowledge. Yeah, now my mind is going blank. And yeah.
Thank you, that was a good answer.
There's the Community Research Symposium and the TCRC Research Forum coming up. Could you talk a little bit about that and how folks can check it out?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so April 9th, right? It's a Wednesday, so it's the annual Tufts symposium, community symposium. That begins with breakfast at 8 a.m. There are keynote speakers and small group discussion about community university partnerships, a big piece about research. And then in the afternoon, students and the community partners are invited to share their research. And we'll have a cafe style presentation of up to 10 student community research projects from 1 to 2 that afternoon. So all of this stuff is on the Tisch website, right? Soon on the Tisch website. But yeah, if you are a student and you're interested in sharing your work, please let me know, because we'd love to have you.
Okay, this seems like a good place to end, given we just made a great plug for the next event. So I'll just say thanks so much for the program. Thank you, Elaine.
Please take guides down here.